Hi, welcome to Kitchen Chats. I am your host, Aimee Kandrac, and today I have the pleasure of introducing you to Colin Campbell, who is joining me via Zoom. And Colin is a writer and director and has been nominated for an Academy Award for a short film that he wrote with his wife, and has a small Broadway show that is live in New York currently, had a stint in LA, and is joining me today because of his Broadway show and a book that he has recently released titled Working Through Profound Loss with Hope and Purpose, which is your first book. Colin, thank
Yeah.
you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a real honor.
So on Kitchen Chats, I always ask all of my guests the same question. But because I know your situation and story, I'm going to ask it slightly differently because I don't, after reading your book, I'm not sure that your answer is going to be the same as everyone else's might be. So the first question that I usually ask people is there a moment that you're willing to share when you had to gather in the kitchen and figure out what's next? But I know from reading your story that your tragedy happened so fast that gathering in the kitchen just didn't probably happen. But I'm wondering if you'll share with everyone now.
Yeah, sure. So my two teenage children were killed by a drunk driver. I was driving, and my wife was in the front seat, and my kids were in the back, Ruby and Hart. Ruby was 17, and Hart was 14, and we were struck by a drunk and high driver. And the first moment that comes to mind in relation to your question is we were actually in the living room, which is very close to the kitchen. So I'm going to say that it kind of counts. It's
Sure.
kitchen adjacent. And that was when our rabbi and the head of our synagogue, the two of them came to our house right away. So we were in Joshua Tree, which is about 2.5 hours east of Los Angeles, at the crash site. And then we had to go to the hospital, and then we had to go to the hospital where Hart was, and then he passed away. And then we were taken home, and then he slept, I think, sort of. And the next morning, very, very early, the rabbi came, Sharon Brous and Melissa Balaban, who's the head of the synagogue, and they sat down with us on the couch and said, we've got to find a cemetery for your children. And it was like, oh, okay, because that's true.
That is true.
You do have to do these things. And in the Jewish tradition, it all happens very quickly. It's important to have the person buried very quickly. I think within 3 days. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of rituals that have to happen, and so it all just happens quickly, and we had to figure out where our children were going to be buried, and that was our kitchen moment of thinking about different synagogues. I mean, not different synagogues, different mortuaries and different cemeteries, and what would be right for them, where they would want to be buried, where we would want them to be buried. And these are questions that obviously we weren't thinking we'd ever have to answer, right?
And 24 hours before that, certainly weren't thinking about having to answer.
Right. Yeah. But I do deeply, deeply appreciate that they were there, literally holding our hands through that terrible process. And then when we did pick a cemetery, our rabbi drove us there and again held our hands through picking out the caskets and the burial plot or burial plots. So there's all the practical parts that you have to do, which made me think about the practical parts of being in a kitchen, figuring out what to do.
Yeah. Wow, those are the it's the practical things that I'm impressed you can remember, you
Mm.
know? I think those are sometimes, just you're so overcome with, emotion, grief, your body was traumatized as well by being
Yeah,
in this vehicle, right? So
yeah,
you
yeah. We
had
were
so
both
much going on.
hurt. Yeah,
Yeah, you were both hurt and
yeah.
and then just shattered,
Right.
um, emotionally. Wow.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like the it's sort of a side comment, but we were hurt. Gail had broken ribs and a cracked sternum and whiplash
Mm,
and horrible bruises from and cuts from the seatbelt, and I had cracked ribs and a lacerated kidney. I think it was a kidney. Something was lacerated in there from the seatbelt, and and we were in a lot of pain. But then as we healed it, that almost felt bad. It almost felt as if I wanted to be in physical pain to somehow mirror my
mm,
emotional pain. And
mhm.
it was a strange process where as I recovered from the accident physically, but was not recovered at all emotionally, it was a further disconnect. So it was a kind
Oh,
of strange process of physically healing.
right.
I almost didn't want it to happen. Strange.
And then just all of the time of healing with the body and how that works, but yet the healing of grief doesn't coincide with that at the same time, like the same speed.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow. Thank you for sharing those really tragic moments. And now even I am finding myself at a loss for words to
Mm.
like to start asking the questions that I want us to dig into because which is exactly the title of your book.
That's right.
Right? Um
Yeah.
because what you experienced is something that is hard to get your head around. And I feel embarrassed to even say that it's hard for me to get my head around because you didn't have a choice,
Hmm.
right? This is what you were doing. What other things did people do or say for you? Or was there anything that anyone could do or say for you other than possibly just be present and hold your hands? That was impactful, that was meaningful, that you would want people to be able to do should anyone
Hmm.
else find themselves in this horrible, horrible situation.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was interesting. So that first day, we sent out an email, a general email, and called a few people, but other people called other people, and so messages came pouring into us, and it was very memorable, the ones that had a positive impact. So there was a lot of like, oh, there are no words. I don't know. I can't imagine. And then there was this young boy, friend of Heart's, and he just wrote this email that just said, I love Heart so much. He meant so much to me. And I'll think about him and love him every day for the rest of my life. And then he shared some moment, some memory he had of Heart. And it was like, oh, this kid knows what to do.
Wow.
Yeah, right.
Mhm.
Just say how much you're in pain over the loss, and then share a story about Heart. That
Right.
was the most helpful. And some adults, to be fair to my friends, are extraordinarily beautiful people, and so many of them did share very specific memories and how heartbroken they were.
Mhm.
But that was the most helpful. The idea that the loss of Ruby and Heart, it wasn't just me, it was shared. It was shared by other people.
Mhm.
That was helpful to me. And then hearing a story, hearing just a memory. And I
Mhm.
think a lot of people are too scared to do that. It sounds like it's such a small thing, and it seems like it kind of makes sense, and yet I don't think I would have done it if the situation were reversed. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? I think I would have been
Right.
like, oh, I better leave them alone. They're like suffering and they need to do it on their own, and then come back to us when they're ready. I don't want to disturb them.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, yeah.
Well, I think you touched on something that I think is really profound and I want to remind myself of, and that is because sometimes I'm like, oh, yikes, I don't want to like, I don't want to talk. I don't like what they're going through is so much.
Hmm.
Um, and I love the person who is lost also, but I don't love them to the same extent that you do.
Right.
Right. So my grief would not trump yours. I don't want to share that, like, but it's not a burden, right? What you
Right.
just said is it's actually the best thing that you heard was that collective, we're not alone in missing them. We're
Yeah.
not alone in having, like, they did have these extraordinary lives and extraordinary friendships with other people, and other people's lives are now impacted because they're no longer with you. And that
Yeah.
reminder is so great. And I think it's really great, for those of us when there is this situation to be reminded we should share that story. We should tell people we're really going to miss them also.
Yeah. 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 I think that the only possible danger is that you're like burdening them with your pain in the sense of you're like asking them to help you. You're like, I
Right,
miss them
right,
so much. Oh God. But so maybe
right.
don't collapse onto the mourner. I did have that happen
Exactly.
once
Oh,
right after the funeral. A large friend kind of collapsed onto me and I had to hold him up. And I
oh,
was
you
just
mean
like,
like physically, really,
yeah,
this
like
collapsed on you
physically.
also.
Yeah, yeah. They were so
Wow.
devastated. And I was like, I was just in a car crash. I can't really
Mm-hmm.
hold you up right now in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
But right, so not burdening them with your pain, but sharing your pain, sharing your feelings of loss so that they don't feel so alone. I think
Right.
that when we lose someone who's dear to us, when we have already a profound loss, we feel lonely. That's the strongest feeling, I think, because they're not here on this earth with us anymore, the central person in our life. And so we're gonna feel lonely no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
And and the idea of having a community that's there for us is going to be helpful in those moments.
So what does that look like, that community?
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes people will give that huge outpouring of support for whatever your religious traditions are in as far as timing, right? I don't know
Yeah.
if there was Shiva after that for you, or you
Yes.
know,
Yes.
but
So
sometimes after that people go away.
yeah. Yeah.
So
And
what does
and
that
I
look
think
like?
that's exactly what happened. So my wife is Jewish, and we raised our kids as Jews, but I'm not Jewish. I was raised atheist and not part of any kind of religious organization. But we leaned heavily on the Jewish traditions, and it really helped us. So we did sit Shiva. Um, it's supposed to be 7 nights after the funeral, and people would come to your house and gather, and that was really remarkable and eye-opening for me to understand how to grieve in community. Because every night we
Mhm.
would share stories about Ruby and Hart, and we'd share stories about our grief. So all day long, we'd be wrestling with these feelings that are really just, so hard to comprehend, so hard to
Mhm.
really believe. There's a real disconnect, a real feeling of like, this is not real. How can this possibly be real? They were here a minute ago and now they're gone. And I don't believe that I'm in the world right now. And so it was so
Yeah.
helpful to share these feelings with people, have them just be validated, heard, witnessed, and then processed. Just helped us
Mhm.
process the loss and literally accept, believe that they were actually killed. It was so hard. But to your point about how people kind of drift away, I think sometimes in the early days of grief, people might reach out and say, "Hey, do you want to go for a walk?" And sometimes the mourner doesn't. They're like,
Right.
"No, I don't have the energy to get out of bed right now." I think that really encourages people to then back off. And
Mhm.
then like a week goes by and this mourner now is ready and they're like, "Where's everybody?"
Mm.
And it's like, well, you told them you didn't want them there and they thought that was permanent and they just ran away. And I think that if you're going to support someone in grief, I think it's so important to keep reaching out,
Mhm.
to take the nose in stride and then whatever, 3 days later, a week, 2 weeks later, reach out again. Do you want to take a walk
Mhm.
now? And I think that's a beautiful way to support somebody because they will absolutely at a certain point say, yes, I do want to go for a walk. I do want to talk about my loss and my grief. Thank you for being there for me. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Hmm. Yeah. And to not take it personally when they're saying no, because it really
Right,
has nothing to do about anything other than you just can't get out of bed.
right, right, right. They're struggling with other things.
With other
They don't have the
things.
bandwidth yet, but they'll need that community.
Hard, I think, for people to remember though. And
Right.
knowing that everyone has a different time frame
Yeah.
for how many times do I reach out without acting like a pest?
Yeah.
And um,
Yeah. I think there's a real fear of like, oh, I'm really bothering them. But from the other side, talking to a lot of people who have grieved the loss of children, because I've been a member of many grief groups, I've never heard anybody say, I get too much attention, I get too much love from my community. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it just doesn't,
right,
I've never heard that. So I think the fears are misplaced. I think that, if you have a real relation, if you're not that close to the person, then yeah, maybe you are going to be bothering them. If you keep reaching out and you're like
right.
a virtual stranger, yeah.
Hmm.
But if you're actually their real friend, then yes, you're not going to be bothering them. They're not overwhelmed with love from their community, so such that they can't take it. You know what I mean? Oh, there's too many people here for me. I
I
don't think
shouldn't
that's true.
laugh at that, but I kind of want to pull that out as a like, let's make this the tagline. People in grief rarely say they are getting too much love from their community. That's just not not
Just haven't heard
something right.
it. and
Oh,
and
yeah.
it's interesting. I feel like I see this now more when because I'm watching films or television, and the person who's grieving a terrible loss is always shown as wanting to go away, run away, and stay away. So like even just an episode of the Last of Us, I just saw a couple weeks ago. He lost his daughter. I don't know if you watched the show or not, but it's a post-apocalyptic
Yeah.
sort of zombie show, and and his daughter was killed early on in the outbreak, and he's with this
Hmm.
other young woman, and the young woman asks him a question about his dead daughter. He's like, "No, don't you dare! Don't you mention her name!" And I'm like, "What? Who is this? Why didn't these writers ask somebody who lost their daughter? Because that sure is not going to say that. Like, no way. Like, don't say her name. What? No, please ask
Right.
me about my dead daughter so I can tell you a loving story. It's crazy, but it happens again and again, over and over again. They'll show the people who've lost, a child or a sibling or a spouse, and they go away and they're like, don't talk about them to me.
Don't talk about them to me. Well, and so you bring up another really important point, which is saying their name is really,
Mm,
really important.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
hearing Ruby and Hart, people asking you, what are you thinking about Ruby and Hart today?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because
Yeah.
people are, again, scared to say their names, but then it becomes a question of, well, if nobody's saying their names, like, how weird is that? Like my
Right.
children who you loved, and now they're like erased from the world. Nobody says their names. It's so surreal, and that didn't happen to me because my friends are lovely people, and but they were, many of them were scared initially to say their names. They didn't know. They didn't know.
They didn't know. Right.
Yeah.
And so making sure people know that like you are thinking about them all the time.
Right.
There are a lot
Yeah.
of special days that you really, really think about them and celebrate them. And whatever holidays and other occasions, like Ruby and Hart are still a part of you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But people don't always know that. People don't always because I think it's sometimes hard to see what emotion you might be triggering for someone.
Right. But here's the thing. I have a totally different relationship to pain and tears because I have to. It's not that I'm
Mhm.
special. It's just that I've suffered this loss. And so so I'm in emotional pain so often, and it's okay because it's part of my love for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I cry often. I cried several times today already. It's actually also today is Hart's birthday. So he would have
Happy
turned 18
birthday.
today. Oh,
Happy birthday. Happy celebration of Heart Day.
yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so yeah, but tears are okay. I think I think you're absolutely right. People are scared if they start telling a beautiful story, I might cry. And it's true. I might cry. That's okay. What's so terrible about that? I'm crying because I've lost my children. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. Um, and so yeah, there was a point where a dear friend of ours, early on, she loved Ruby and Hart so deeply, and so she came over to our house, and she'd be all chipper and peppy, and want to be like, "Ha ha! Hey, cheer me up! Let's have a good time." And it got to the point where I had to pull her aside and say, listen, it's hard for. I love that you're so. I've loved that you're so optimistic, but right now in this moment, I can't really take it. And she said, well, if I don't do that, I'm going to burst into tears. I said, well, that's okay. And she burst into tears. we cried together. It's like, it's okay. It's okay to
Mm-hmm.
cry together. And then the cries stop, the tears stop, and then you can have a good time, and then you can laugh. But to not avoid the tears, I think, is helpful.
Yeah. I'm I'm in tears now thinking of this for you. Um,
Yeah.
and the celebrations that you don't have with your children. Sorry, I'm a little stuck on it for you. Like,
Yeah, it's okay.
um, thank you. Yeah. But reminding people that the shared tears are healing and special.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think sometimes I certainly felt this way early on in grief. I was scared that I would never stop crying if I started.
Oh,
And
yeah.
if I started in, because I wasn't just crying, I was keening, right? It was real
Hmm.
guttural, visceral
Right.
weeping happening.
Right.
um yeah, keening, really. And there's that fear of, if I really let myself feel these feelings, they'll never stop, and I'll be overwhelmed, and I
Hmm.
can't take it. And that's not how it works. It's just not
Right.
how it physically works. So you weep, you keen, you wail, and then it subsides.
Yeah.
And the grief comes in waves, and you let it take you, and trust that it's going to bring you back. That's just part of grief. And I know there was one woman early on in a grief group, where she said, "I don't think about my daughter who died. I don't think
Sure.
about her because I'm scared. I'm scared to if I what will happen if I do." And it's like, well, I know exactly what would happen if you do, and it's okay.
And it's okay.
Yeah, yeah,
And it's special when you have a community around you who's willing to support you and go through this with you.
yeah, yeah. The Just to give a little shout out to the Jews, um, they have this. They have many beautiful rituals around mourning. I talk a lot about them in my book
Uh-huh.
because it really did teach me literally how to mourn my children. So I'm forever indebted. But just one is that there's the mourner's prayer, the mourner's Kaddish. You're supposed to say it every day for the first year after the death of a loved one.
Hmm.
And first of all, that's amazing because it's saying you have to keep re-engaging with your loss. You can't just compartmentalize it. You have to
Yeah.
find a way to live with it, right? Every day for a year. So that means that you are allowing grief into your life to go alongside you and not just trying to box it up. But you can't say that prayer unless there are at least 9 other people with you. So you
Oh,
say it,
really?
yes, you say it with a minion, not 10 people
Uh-huh.
completely, 10, including yourself. And you say it in community, and they amen at several times during the prayer. And so it's almost like, um, you know, you're grieving, but don't grieve alone. Grieve in
Right.
community, grieve with people witnessing your pain, and then amening your expression of grief. It's
Hmm.
so beautiful. It's
That is
such a
so
brilliant
beautiful.
idea. The opposite of what I think people expect, which is that the griever goes away in their own little corner, and then they cry until they get it all out, and then they're all fixed, and they come back to society when they're fixed. It's like, no, no, please
No.
don't do that.
So you had part of this grieving time though during COVID.
Yes,
So
yes,
you had that like extra layer then of
yeah,
um because that whole year, right? So this the accident happened in June of 19,
yes,
correct?
yes,
So
yes,
you still had a few months of this group prayer
right. And then it became
isolated, right?
isolated. Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, and by the way, I don't call it an accident. I call it a
Okay, thank you.
crash.
Thank you. Thank you. I
It's
appreciate
okay.
that.
Yeah, yeah. Just because she didn't
Sure.
accidentally, the driver didn't accidentally get drunk and didn't accidentally get high and didn't accidentally get behind the wheel and didn't accidentally speed. But
Really
uh,
important
yeah,
differentiation. Yeah.
yeah. The COVID was very strange, that experience, because on the one hand, it was it was alienating because the whole world was in lockdown and grieving this new strange world, and it was
Right.
like it wasn't the top of our list, me and Gail, my wife. So COVID was like a, oh yeah, and also there's COVID. You know, because
Right.
Ruby and Hart just died, and oh yeah, and the whole world is in lockdown. So
Like,
that felt
yeah.
weird to have
Hmm.
everybody, the whole world felt like united, and we weren't exactly a part of it because we were having our own thing. But of
Right.
course, other people were grieving as well. But that's how it felt to us. And the other thing is that everybody was forced to be with their families. They're locked down with their families, and that's
And you
all we
didn't.
wanted. And
Yeah.
people were complaining, obviously, like, oh God, I'm stuck with my kids all day long. And it's like, oh, that's all we
Oh,
want. That's all we want. Um, so
yeah.
that was alienating as well. But the whole world felt alienating, right, to everybody, because we're all in this strange world. So
But
yeah,
so you talk, and you mentioned this briefly a minute ago, but you talk in your book about other rituals
yeah,
that you found really, really healing, helpful. Tell us about some of those.
yeah. So again, I got the inspiration from the Jews. Uh, so there's several rituals, but then there's the after 30 days after the funeral, you're supposed to mark the end of Shloshim. Shloshim is 30 in Hebrew, and it means the first 30 days after the funeral. You're supposed to mark it somehow, but they
Hmm.
don't say how to mark it. But you have to have some kind of a ceremony. And so we realized we had to create our own ceremony. That's the deal. And so
Oh.
we created our own ritual. We gathered like 80 close friends in at the Los Angeles Arboretum. It was a favorite place of the four of us. We all four
Hmm.
loved it there. We had many happy memories there. So we dedicated 2 trees to Ruby and Hart, and we gathered our friends, and a friend sang a beautiful song, and a rabbi came and said some prayers, and we all held, touched our shoulders and touched the trees and just felt the absence of Ruby and Hart, and then also told Ruby and Hart stories, funny Ruby and Hart stories. People laughed and cried, and it felt so good. It was hard. It wasn't easy, but it felt good. And we realized, oh, we can do that some more. So
Hmm.
anytime we're struggling, we could make up a ritual, gather people, and do something in honor
Right.
of Ruby and Hart and our grief. And so my book is full of all these different rituals that we devised in the first few years after the crash, that have helped us. And so
Hmm.
one of the ones when we were in Joshua Tree, that's where we were locked down in Joshua Tree. And during COVID, we thought, oh no, how are we going to do one of our rituals? Nobody
Mm.
can come. We're all isolated.
Hmm.
And then this lovely friend of Ruby said, can I write Ruby a birthday, a birthday card, a birthday note, send her a birthday letter? And we realized, because this is in March, and at the end of March is when Ruby and Hart's birthdays are. So the
Hmm.
whole world's in lockdown. We're all alone. How are we going to get through their birthdays? And
Hmm.
thought, oh, I know. We'll ask everybody to write a letter to Ruby and Hart, a birthday letter to Ruby and Hart. And so that's how we got our community again to help us. We asked for help and they delivered, and had like 140 letters, and we took them up into the rocks and read each one out loud to Ruby and Hart. And we wept. We could only do like 6 to 8 letters a day because it was just too emotionally wrenching. But it was beautiful. It helped us. It organized our days. It gave us some meaning and purpose. It connected us to our friends, community, and it also connected us to Ruby and Hart. And also people occasionally shared stories that we had forgotten or never knew about Ruby and Hart. So we'd open a letter and we'd hear this charming, funny, beautiful story about one of our kids that we never knew about. And it's like, oh my God, what a beautiful gift that was. And it wouldn't have happened.
And what a gift you were able to give them to remember them as well.
Yeah. It was very clear that all our friends got a lot out of it. That it was hard, right, to write this letter, but they all did it and they all got a lot out of it. And so it was like, wow, this is clearly so helpful. And I'm so grateful to Ruby's friend to give us that idea, and that we then took her up on it in a big way. And asked for help like that.
Oh, that's amazing. That is just such a beautiful situation that you were able to create out of what just horrible experience and isolation that the world was feeling anyway.
Yeah. And I think it's so easy for people in grief to isolate, to just feel like, oh, what do I do with the day of their birth, right? I'm mourning this person and they were born this day. What an awful day. And then Gail and I have always tried to find some way to make it not an awful day, but instead somehow honor them and honor our grief. And it helps us immensely. And so I'm doing this solo show that you mentioned, not technically on Broadway, but
Theater Row. Theater Row. It's closer than most people get.
It's very close to Broadway, but it's on 42nd Street. But I purposely chose to perform my solo show on Ruby and Hart's birthdays, which was yesterday and today, because that was my way of handling the day, right? Even doing this podcast with you today on Hart's birthday, it's so much better to take action, for me to take action and do something rather than just sit in sadness all by myself.
Oh, thank you for sharing and allowing me to be a part of this, and allowing our listeners to learn so much through your sadness and grief and journey, right? Like, just the unimaginable, to now allowing others to have the opportunity to learn from your healing process.
Well, I really thank you for saying that. I really get a lot out of the idea of normalizing grief, the idea of combating that misunderstanding that I received from the media, from film and television. Like I said,
you just saw it.
All these, and always the tougher the character, the more isolated they'll be in grief. And if they're really, really super macho and fierce and they can fight people, if they lose a loved one, that's when they run away. It's like, well, if they're really tough, wouldn't they lean into that pain too?
Right.
Lean into the emotional pain and let themselves feel that. But that's what we get from our media. So I love countering that.
I love that you're countering that, and appreciate that I can talk to you about this, because my goal is to destigmatize asking for help.
Yes.
And receiving it, because it is sometimes hard to accept the help that people might want to offer. And sometimes you don't even know what help that is, right? Like, your story that you started with, when your rabbi and the head of the congregation, you didn't even know you needed to go look for those things that day.
Yeah.
Which
I wasn't thinking about it.
Yeah. But you don't even know the kind of help that you need.
Right.
And how hard that can be.
Yeah. I think it is hard. It's hard for me. It's always been hard for me to like accept help, and I think because of the extremity of the situation, I just realized I needed it. Like whatever my cultural biases were, I was going to throw them out the window because I just needed it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that helped. So in the book, I talk about like a grief spiel, which I sort of touched on earlier, but the idea that people would come to our house and they'd be so scared to talk to us.
Mm-hmm.
And I clearly needed to talk to my friends. I needed their help. So I had to find some way to break this barrier down. I couldn't have them tiptoeing around the subject of death or Ruby and Heart. So Gail and I developed this grief spiel where we would tell friends exactly what we needed. Here's how the conversation has to go. We got to talk about Ruby and Heart. We got to talk about our grief, and we could talk about other things for a little bit, but then we got to circle right back to our grief.
Uh-huh.
And it was just so helpful to tell people exactly what we needed. And I think normally I wouldn't have done that, but it was just so extreme. I had no choice.
You didn't have any choice. But
Yeah.
you also gave them the direction and the like expectation. Okay, great. Now I know what we're doing.
Right.
And
Yes. Like, here's the guidelines.
here are the guidelines, and I'm stepping into it, and this is what you've said you want. So let's do it. I mean, probably not with that much gusto.
Oh yeah, no, I probably was. I can be pretty blunt.
I can too. So
Okay,
I
good.
appreciate the oh yeah. Like, let's just say, okay, this is what we're doing. I love the grief spiel. I think
Oh,
it is beautiful and healthy, and helpful would that be for so many people, just to know, okay, this is what we're doing. We've got, I do not come from a Jewish background. And I think the idea of sitting Shiva for 7 nights is so beautiful and
yeah,
helpful. And if
yeah,
you can say, I know we've got 7 nights, we're walking in, we've got a plan. Like, we're talking about Ruby and Heart, we're sharing some stories. We'll probably clean up for a few minutes, then we're going back and talking right about this again.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. And from my perspective, I didn't want to do that initially. Initially, I was like, people are coming to my house. Like,
mhm.
no, this is a terrible idea. But I just trusted in the Jews. So I just do whatever the rabbi says. Literally, I was like, whatever the rabbi, I'll just do it. And then I learned. I learned like, oh, right, this is
Mhm.
important. I need this. And that was so helpful to have that structure in place, because I think almost anybody would say just no to that, like no to Shiva. But because there's
Yeah.
you're supposed to do it, they do it, and then it helps. And I think
Mhm.
that's, I don't know. I wish everybody in every religion did some version of Shiva. They could change the
Yeah.
name or something. But the idea of just making, no, people are going to come to your house. They're going to be there for you, whether you want them or not. It's like, well, that would be helpful.
That would be helpful. That would be
Yeah.
great. Are there any other big, if anyone's going through this, please do not forget this big lesson that I have learned
Hmm.
type of things
Yeah.
you'd like to share?
I think it's someone going through another catastrophic loss like mine, you mean? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What was helpful for me was the idea of not being afraid of the pain.
Mm-hmm.
It's so scary in early, profound grief. You're scared that you're losing your mind, um, that you'll literally go insane, that
Mm-hmm.
you'll never stop weeping,
Mm-hmm.
that you won't survive it. And so that fear, I think, well, at least for me, it made me like tighten in a little bit and get scared of being present with the pain. And it took me a little while to figure out that the pain was okay,
Mm-hmm.
that I would stop weeping. It's okay to weep, and it's okay to feel like I'm going out of my mind. I'll come back to reality. And so I wish I could have told myself then, don't be so scared, even though it's
Mm-hmm.
scary.
Even though it's
Um,
really scary.
yeah, lean into the pain of it. This is a very specific thing I talk about in my show. It was very scary to go to sleep at night in the early days after the crash. I had terrible nightmares,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and just being asleep is a vulnerable place because you're letting go, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so as an adult, it doesn't seem so scary, but then when you have this horrible loss, it suddenly becomes scary. It's like a little kid going to sleep, and it's scary.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought at one point I said to Gail, because we were both just terrified and this is horrible. I said, let's try and not think about Ruby and Heart after 9 o'clock as a way to be able to fall asleep. So like we'll
Oh,
mourn all day long, but like at 9 o'clock, we'll stop thinking about them or talking about them. So we'll be able to fall asleep and not be terrified. And that just didn't work at all. No, no, you can't,
you
can't do
okay.
that.
I mean, it is kind of the opposite of everything you just described that we should
Exactly.
be doing, right?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that was a mistake. I'm saying that was
Right.
a
Yeah.
fail.
Yeah.
That was the failure.
Well,
That
I
that did
know.
not work
Yeah.
at all. And so then I learned, actually, if I do the opposite, if I think about Ruby and Heart as I'm falling asleep and I let myself weep in bed, I'll sleep better. It's just how it goes. I'll have less nightmares and I'll wake
Wow.
up feeling less wretched. So yeah, I'd say lean into the pain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Colin, it has been such a pleasure and an honor. And on this day, especially as
Oh,
you celebrate Heart, and I know yesterday you celebrated Ruby. Thank
yeah.
you, thank you, thank you for joining me. But I have
Oh,
one last question for you that I like to
yes.
end the podcast with. And that is, if you have a friend who is going through some crisis, profound loss, what is the first thing that you like to do to support them?
Well, I, I think offer a concrete activity like a walk. Like I'm
Mm-hmm.
available, and not just I'll do whatever you want, but actually say I'm available to walk at 10 a.m. for the next 3 days.
Mm-hmm.
Something very concrete and specific. Make it easier for that person to say yes to it. And then on that walk, ask how they're doing today.
Mm-hmm.
How are you doing today? It's much easier to answer than just how are you doing. But
Right.
how's your grief today? And
Yeah.
and
Or
not
so
be
far today.
yeah, or so far today, or this hour. How's your
Mm-hmm.
grief? How are you feeling right now? And not being afraid to ask that question because you're worried they might have a rough answer. They might
Because
burst
they
into
might.
tears.
Yeah.
That's okay. They need to if that's what's happening.
Yeah. Well, that's a beautiful opportunity to offer a friend. So,
Yeah.
Colin, thank you so much for joining me. Good luck
Oh,
with your show.
thank
And
you.
uh, I hope for no one else that they experience a profound loss like you have, but should they, uh, your book, your words, and everything that I know you will continue to create in honor of your beautiful children will be really helpful. So
Oh,
thank you.
thank you. Thank you so much.